Okay, we are live, but feel free to give another minute till we have more people join. Thank you both. Thank you so much, Michelle and Nilu, for agreeing and presenting this really important information in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We are live, so take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nilu Abdi Tabari, and I am the managing attorney of the Domestic Relations Unit over here at Atlanta Legal Aid. And I will let Michelle Jordan introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Jordan. I'm a senior family law attorney with Atlanta Legal Aid, and we're excited to be with you to observe Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
All right, and with that, we will get started. So October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and one of the key components of the work and the individuals that we assist at Legal Aid involves domestic violence and our survivors of domestic violence. So we're going to take a few moments to discuss what domestic violence is, looking for lethality factors, things that are going to make domestic violence more dangerous than it already is, things that are going to heighten safety concerns. And then we're going to talk about some remedies in terms of protective orders, different types. And Michelle is going to explain what that TPO process looks like, because it is an emergency order and has a very specific set of processes and rules. With that, we only have an hour to go through a ton of information. So if I am speed talking, I apologize from the beginning, but we will do our best to get through this information. Okay, so one of the very key components of intimate partner violence is the definition. And that is that intimate partner violence is not physical violence and physical violence alone, and physical violence itself is not a key indicator of heightened danger or lethality. Intimate partner violence is a pattern of physical, sexual, emotional abuse and or other forms of abuse that are used to exert and maintain control and power over the partner. Abuse does not end when the relationship ends. It in fact heightens the danger in the situation. It can take many shapes and forms. It is about control. The end of the relationship only heightens the need to maintain control and power over the other partner because the abuser is losing control of that situation. This is the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. So oftentimes when we have clients that are coming to us at the end of a relationship, seeking remedies for the end of that relationship, the danger when we talk about intimate partner violence has only heightened. It has not dissipated or disappeared with the end of that relationship. So one of the key components or tools of those that work with victims of intimate partner violence is what we call the power and control wheel. And this defines and identifies many of the different forms of intimate partner violence. Again, as we stated, physical violence is only one component of it. So using coercion and threats, economic abuse, right? Financial control is such a key component in intimate partner violence. And one of the things that we really have to work hard to combat when we're looking at the end of a relationship: intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation from family and friends, and using children to exert control over the abused in these situations. So this power and control wheel does a very good job of identifying the fact that physical abuse is not the only form of abuse. There are many forms. And in most relationships, you're not just going to see one of these things, you're going to see different components of these things, and you're also going to see it change when some of these forms of control stop working. Another key component of intimate partner violence is the cycle of violence. And what we mean by that is when we talk about intimate partner violence, there is often what we call a buildup phase. So this is when the abuser is so amping up, right? They're becoming increasingly tense and irritable. And this is often when our survivor or our victim can really sense what is about to come. And they're going to work really hard to try to prevent that explosive phase, which is phase 2, where we see that attack, which again can be verbal, emotional, psychological, physical, and or sexual. Right? So when we say explosive, again, it doesn't just mean physical. And so they're going to be working really hard to prevent that explosive phase. And then once that occurs, we often see the abuser being remorseful, right? And we call this the honeymoon phase, where they're trying to make it up to the person. They're making promises that it'll never occur again. But this is often a cycle. And so it is going to occur again. And what we mean by that is in this buildup phase, when we see our victims, trying to placate the abuser, they do that because this has happened before. And they're going to recognize that cycle as it's coming. Well, this is a very key component, I often say, with protective orders in particular, because people will often come seeking assistance in this buildup phase, right? And they're not able to identify something that has happened, right? This act, this explosive act, whatever it may be. But they can sense what is about to come. But when we are knowledgeable about intimate partner violence, then we can ask the right questions and say, they are feeling threatened because this has occurred before, right? So they are sensing a pattern. So when we recognize that this is a phase, and a cycle, then we can ask the right questions and look to those previous acts to understand why individuals are seeking help when they are. I think it's very important for our survivors and our victims as well to understand that this is a pattern and that it will occur again. So the statistics regarding intimate partner violence are can be very shocking. I think one of the things that I often try to really hone in on is that the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. And that does not matter who has the gun. It could be the victim, it could be the abuser. It is the presence of a gun that increases the risk of homicide by 500%. Guns are not the solution. They are not the safety mechanism that we think they are in these particular situations. Firearms were the cause of death in 71% of recorded domestic fatalities in 2016. So we can see that firearms are particularly problematic when we talk about domestic violence. So people can be abused regardless of gender, education level, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, religion, and race. There are no borders to being abused. Who are abusers? It can be anybody of any gender, any education level, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, religion, or race. Again, intimate partner violence has no boundaries. So what do abusers have in common? What abusers have in common across the board is control. Again, that is what intimate partner violence is about for our abusers. Typically extreme jealousy, and I don't mean like a romantic way, right? What we mean is it takes on a controlling nature. They want to know who you're with, where you are. Send me a picture of where you are. Scan the room where you are, right? This is not a romantic gesture. This is a component of control that an abuser will use. One of the key components of an abuser that is often very um, telling is what I call the public face versus the private face. And that is the person that they are to the public versus who they are to their victim or victims in a private or personal setting. So they will often present themselves as charismatic individuals, caring individuals. That's their public face. And what this does is it creates a barrier to our victims when they are telling their stories, when they are seeking help. They are not believed, right? Their story isn't believed because who could believe that this person who presents themselves this way to the public is committing the atrocities that are being explained to them? And again, when we talk about these components of control, these aren't things that are just exist in a vacuum. These are acts that an abuser is deliberately taking to create impediments for our victims so that they cannot leave the relationship. It is about power and control. These are deliberate acts. Even this public face that they present to society creates a barrier for our victims of violence. Why did she stay, right? So why do our victims stay in these relationships? That is the wrong question. We ask it all the time, but it is the wrong question. The appropriate question is, why do abusers abuse? An example that I often use here is think about your current situation. Let's say you wanted to leave your job, right? You've decided that this no longer works for you. Let's say it's a toxic environment. What kind of steps would you have to take to be able to leave that situation, right? Would you be able to walk out the next day? Or would you have to make plans, right? Would you have to look for another job? Would you have to try to figure out how you're going to pay your rent or your bills? How are you going to feed your children if there are children involved? You would have to take multiple steps and you would have to plan to extricate yourself from that situation. Now imagine this is your spouse or your partner and there's children, and your abuser has created these many hurdles to seeking safety, right? And now you have to overcome all of these things. So why did she stay? Wrong question. Why are abusers abusing? That is the question that we really need to be focused on. Unfortunately, it is a question that gets asked. So we often talk about, why is it that someone would stay in this situation? It could be religious beliefs or community status, right? These are not small things in our lives. These are things that carry a heavy weight and a burden with them. These are our communities, right? Stockholm syndrome, remaining for children, low self-esteem, self-blame, isolation. Again, these things are created by the abuser, right? When there's psychological abuse, when there's emotional abuse, when there's financial abuse, all of those things that we identified on the power and control wheel. These are the hurdles created by the abuser, okay? But one of the things that I always like to highlight is hope and love, right? We cannot minimize the fact that this is someone that a victim often loved, right? And they built hopes and dreams around a life with this person, right? The life that they would live. They had children together, possibly, right? And the life that they would build for their children. So these are not small things to walk away from. They are very difficult. And you add to that the risk of homicide increases dramatically when our victims are trying to extricate themselves from these relationships. So one of the key components when I'm looking at intimate partner violence is I trying to identify those factors that we say increase lethality, right? So what are those things that we can look to say this situation is becoming even more dangerous, right? That we're seeing sort of a rise in the danger. And attempted strangulation, sexual assault, an increase in attacks, threats to kill. Words are not just words, right? Access to firearms, we've discussed. Animal and pet abuse is a very key indicator of heightened risk in an intimate partner situation. Controlling or jealous behavior, a victim's efforts to leave or sever the relationship. We've talked about how that heightens the risk dramatically. Depression, thoughts of suicide, a victim's terror. I often say that our victims know the situation better than anybody else. Their gut is telling them something, and we have to listen to them when they're trying to express that feeling to us. Harassment and stalking type behaviors. So these are some of those lethality factors, again, listed out, and these were identified by the Georgia Fatality Review from 2018, which I believe was their penultimate issue in terms of this analysis. So one of the things that really stuck out to me when we started to do some of this analysis into lethality factors, right? Like, how do we identify situations that are becoming more dangerous? How do we help those that we're assisting? How do we provide knowledge for those who are in these situations so that they can recognize that things are becoming more dangerous? So, and so what we have here are statistics from the Georgia Domestic Violence Fatality Review. So in the very first statistic, a history of domestic violence against a victim, and this is analysis of those that were murdered in a domestic violence situation. So of those murdered and identified between 2004 and 2018 in Georgia, 91% had a known history of domestic violence. When we look to documented injuries at the time of law enforcement contact, only 5% of those victims of homicide in a domestic violence situation had visible injuries. Okay, what does that tell us? If we are in court and we are relying, right, on evidence of physical injuries in a police report, then we have missed the mark, right? If that's what we're using as an indicator of lethality, of how dangerous the situation is, we've missed a component of this. Stalking behaviors in a relationship, 58% of the victims of domestic violence, there was stalking behaviors, known stalking behaviors, 58%. When we talk about strangulation, there was 23% known history of strangulation. And again, while this is an indicator, certainly, of increased risk and violence, I think the point that we're trying to drive home is that we have to look to all the factors, and that if we are, again, focused on physical injuries, proof of physical injuries, and physical acts, then we are not doing a full analysis of the lethality of a situation. In 38% of cases, the perpetrator made threats to harm the victim with a weapon. In 55% of the cases, threats to kill the victim were made by the perpetrator. Again, here we see threats had a higher, were a higher indicator of lethality than, again, physical injuries or police reports that indicated physical injuries, right? So these threats are a higher indicator of lethality. Again, this is about capturing the full story when we're trying to look at lethality in domestic violence situations. In 56% of the homicides due to domestic violence, there was a 56% known history of monitoring and controlling behaviors. Again, what is domestic violence about? It is about control. It is about power. When do we see increased lethality? When the abuser, when the perpetrator is losing control, right? Attitudes of ownership over the victim in the relationship, there was a 26% known history of attitudes of ownership. Again, sort of capturing what we've been describing all along about what a domestic violence relationship is and what it looks like. Isolation of the victim in 32% of the known victims. So again, when we go back to that power and control wheel, when we think about all those components and acts of intimate partner violence, again, the key component to walk away from this is that when we are assessing lethality, we should not minimize all the components of intimate partner violence. We should recognize all those different components. And we shouldn't just focus on physical violence as a indicator of lethality in these situations. And here we see relationship status at the time of a domestic violence homicide. 33% were married or in a civil union. 25% were separated. 19% were in a long-term relationship but not married. 8% were divorced. 7% formally dated. 5% formally in long-term relationships. 4% were dating. So when you sort of add up these numbers, those that were out of the relationship, and whether it was marriage or a relationship or dating, there was an increased risk of lethality. And the reason we're seeing this is often because, again, when people have removed themselves or tried to remove themselves from these behaviors, when those control and power tactics of the abuser are no longer working, this is when we have heightened lethality. And again, here we just have a solid list of some of those lethality factors. So now that we've identified what intimate partner violence is, and we've talked a bit about lethality in intimate partner relationships, one of the key tools, a civil tool, right, in court is something that we call a temporary protective order. It's not a criminal case, so this doesn't involve the police. It doesn't involve the state of Georgia. This is when we have a victim of abuse filing a protective order against the perpetrator. So what is a temporary protective order? It is a civil, as opposed to criminal, order of protection, which generally restricts the ability of the person the TPO is filed against to contact or come near the person in need of protection. So there are multiple types of protective orders, and I think it's important to talk about the different types and the remedies that are available to you depending on the type of protective order. Now, people will often focus on the name of the protective order, right? So they'll say, well, if there's stalking behaviors, I should file a stalking protective order. if it's an act of violence, I'm going to file a family violence protective order. And that is not the way that you choose which form of protective order you need to file. The type of protective order that you seek is determined by your relationship with the other party. That is the key component. So that is what is going to drive which type of protective order that you file, and then the remedies that are available to you. And that'll make a little bit more sense as we sort of go through those. So we have family violence, we have stalking from the previous slide. We also have dating violence protective order, which is a little bit newer, that was established just a few years ago to sort of cover a gap between the family violence and the stalking protective order. So let's dive into family violence protective orders a bit. So again, what are we looking for? We are looking for a certain type of relationship that is established by statute. We are looking for an act of family violence as established by the statute. We also need to establish, right? So these are all ands. We have to have all of these things. The likelihood that the violence will occur again in the future, right? And this kind of makes sense when we talk about that cycle of violence where we say this is a pattern of behavior, right? It has occurred in the past, it will occur again in the future. That is one of the components of obtaining a family violence protective order. So what are the relationships that would indicate that you need a family violence protective order? Married or divorced, okay? If you have a child together, if you have lived together, if there is a parent-child relationship, this includes foster and stepchildren. It does not include strictly dating relationships, and we'll talk about what that means. Now, here, when we talk about a family violence protective order, and then we identify these relationships, it is because some of the remedies available, right? So because we are going to be often dealing with people who are married or divorced, or they have children together or live together, it expands the scope of the issues that the court needs to deal with, right? It may need to address child support. It may need to address custody. It may need to address property, right? Who's going to stay in the marital home or in the apartment or whatever it may be, right? And in terms of addressing these things, that's why this relationship is important. The relationship identifies the type of protective order, and then that is going to give us the remedies that make sense for those relationships. If you were just dating, never lived together, didn't have a child together, well, you don't need to address child support, right? You don't need to address custody. So it's not going to apply to you in the same way. So what is the relief? What are the remedies that a family violence protective order is going to provide you, right? It can give possession of a home. It can provide an eviction. It can do damage reimbursement, custody, visitation, FVIP, that's the Family Violence Intervention Program. There is a federal firearm prohibition that is part of a family violence protective order. Again, we talked about how important it is that guns be addressed as part of a protective order. Again, it heightens that risk by 500%. Child support, spousal support, it could require a respondent. That means the person it has been filed against, the perpetrator, to maintain alternate housing. It can address property awards. And we can see all the other remedies listed here on this slide. Just a reminder that the Family Violence Protective Order, you have to have an act of violence as defined by the statute that gives rise to this relief. So it cannot be used solely for an eviction, right? If people need to deal with an eviction, that needs to be handled in the appropriate court in the appropriate manner. This is just a remedy as part of a family violence protective order. The required offenses, so what are those things that will give rise to a family violence protective order? Any felony, strangulation, rape, kidnapping, burglary, arson, battery, simple assault, criminal damage to property, criminal trespass, unlawful restraint, and stalking. So again, if you have a married couple and there are stalking behaviors, you don't file a stalking protective order, right? You would file a family violence protective order because stalking behaviors give rise to this relief, okay? So now that we've talked a little bit about stalking, let's talk about stalking protective orders. So stalking protective orders define stalking as stalking is allowing and placing under surveillance or contacting someone without that person's consent for the purpose of harassing and intimidating that person. So it is a knowing and willful course of action which causes that person emotional distress by placing them in reasonable fear for his or her safety, or the safety of a member of his or her immediate family by establishing, and this is really important, a pattern of harassing and intimidating behavior which serves no legitimate purpose. Okay, so again, here, that pattern of the harassing and intimidating behavior, what creates a pattern of behavior? Typically, it's not really identified by statute, but the courts really want to see at least 2 or 3 acts that have occurred, right? That establish, again, a pattern of behavior. It's not a singular act that has occurred, and it can't serve a legitimate purpose, right? So if Michelle loaned me $100 and which she would never do because she knows me better than that. But if she loaned me $100 and I never paid her back, and then she texted me once a week for the next 3 months asking for that money, that's not harassing and intimidating behavior if it serves a legitimate purpose, which is to get her $100 from me, right? So as long as it's not I'm going to harm you if you don't pay me, right? But if it's just a, hey, I'm checking in, I loaned you this money, you told me you'd pay me back by this date, right? So again, pattern of harassing and intimidating behavior can't serve a legitimate purpose. So what type of relief does a stalking protective order involve? Well, again, we don't have in stalking protective orders, we do not have married couples. We don't have individuals who are living together. We don't have people who have children together. So there are things that do not need to be addressed, right? We don't need child support. We don't need custody and visitation. We don't need spousal support, eviction. And here we can see that our list of remedies becomes limited because the relationship does not warrant that relief. Do notice, I already skipped past it, but the federal firearm prohibition that you can get in a family violence protective order is not something that you can obtain as part of a stalking protective order. We'll skip through this one because I know we're running low on time, and Michelle's going to talk a bit about process. One of our newest protective orders is the dating violence protective order. And this was important because if we had individuals who had dated but not lived together and there wasn't a pattern of behavior, they sort of fell into a gap when we talked about the family violence protective order and the stalking protective order. And so they didn't necessarily have a civil remedy in a protective order. They'd have to seek criminal remedies. And the dating violence protective order sought to sort of bridge that gap between them. Again, you need a certain type of relationship. An act of family violence is defined by statute, and the likelihood that the violence will occur again in the future. Again, everything is about a pattern of behavior. So here again, what we have to look to is the relationship between the parties, and that is defined again by statute. And that is that if they are in a committed romantic relationship characterized by a level of intimacy that is not associated with mere friendship or between persons in an ordinary business, social, or emotional context, provided, however, that such term shall not require any sexual involvement. It must have been within the past 6 months. It includes persons through whom a current pregnancy has developed. So if you had just dated, never lived together, and you were pregnant, again, you were precluded from a family violence protective order. We see the dating violence protective order capturing those who are pregnant. So what relief does a dating violence protective order provide? Again, we don't see child support and custody and visitation because the child has not been born, right? So can't exactly come up with a parenting plan in those scenarios. And the child's needs may not be known until the child is born. So there's no spousal support, there's no marriage. Again, the relationship itself is going to determine some of those remedies. Unfortunately, again, here the federal firearm prohibition does not apply to dating violence protective orders. The required offenses for a dating violence protective order are any felony, battery, simple assault, and stalking. The dating violence protective order does require findings to establish that dating relationship. We saw in our first slide regarding this topic that it has a bit of a convoluted definition as to what is and is not dating. And so the statute itself is going to sort of lay out the things that you need to establish that dating relationship, right? Unfortunately, when we talk about people who are married or have children, it's a little bit easier when we have something like dating, right, which can mean so many different things to so many different people. It requires a definition by statute. And from there, we'll have Michelle talk a little bit about what that process of a protective order is going to look like.
Okay, so we're going to just talk about the logistics about how do you actually get a protective order now that we understand how important they are. Okay, so the first thing I always recommend that people do is to talk to a domestic violence provider. And I put some examples of providers in Metro Atlanta who are available to assist with this process. And working with a domestic violence provider is important for two reasons. One, they will help you with the actual logistics of filling out the protective order and walking you through the process, which is amazing, and it's a free service. But also, they'll help you navigate the safety planning elements of it, the emotional elements of it. What makes family violence so difficult is because this is someone that you had a relationship with, and it's hard to just separate the emotions from the legal remedies you need to pursue. So, all right. So then the first step is contact a domestic violence provider. And then the next step is you will typically go to the courthouse to fill out the petition and file it. And now I put a little asterisk there because in some counties you will go someplace else. Like in Gwinnett County, they have some special arrangements. So, but you're going to talk to your domestic violence provider about where that would be. When you get there, you will fill out a petition for a temporary protective order. It is a standard form, and you're just going to fill in your information, your name. There's a section to talk about the violence that was done and to list the help that you need from the court. Like, do you need custody? Do you need possession of the home? Do you need child support? What kind of things you need? So that just gets into that petition, and then you sign it and get it notarized. Okay, and then you're going to sign that in front of a notary. And then the next thing is it's going to be reviewed by a judge who is on duty today for the day. And they will hear from you, ask you some quick questions. And then if they approve it, then they can go ahead and sign the order. So you'll present your case, which just means tell your story. And then at the end of it, you will get a signed order. We call this an ex parte order, and that just means an order that was issued without the other side being present, which is a magical thing you can do in a temporary protective order case. Okay, so the next thing you're going to do is make sure that you get extra copies of the order because you want to have those available to give to other people. You're going to contact the sheriff's office, and if you're working with a provider or a domestic violence advocate, they can help you with this process. But you want to contact law enforcement to have the abuser served with the court papers. Then you will you should check your paperwork and double check your hearing date because you're going to have one more court date. And this is where the other side gets to be present. Keep extra copies of your orders on your person, like physically with you. Keep it at your child's school, keep it at your workplace. That way, if the abuser shows up anywhere, you can quickly pull out the physical copy of the order, so the police know that they need to remove the abuser. To prepare for your next court date, if you have children, I do recommend doing a child support worksheet, just to have that ready. If you're going to ask for child support, it just makes it easier. And then you want to check with your domestic violence advocate about service to confirm that the abuser has been served with the court papers. Um, and then on the day of your hearing, people get nervous about being in court, but temporary protective order hearings are short and they are focused. So I like to recommend that you, first of all, ahead of time, write out what you want to say, just brief bullet points about the violence that happened, um, and the history of prior violence, and that you are concerned that it will happen again in the future. Just kind of really stay very tight on that. And then at the end, if you want to add in, and I could use some child support, here is my worksheet, something like that. But you always want to lead with the violence specifically. Sometimes people get distracted, and that can affect how the judge understands your story. And then you want to make sure that you get there early for your court date. Check in with your advocate if you have questions. Okay. And then you're going to be in the courtroom. There will be other people there. There will be a deputy there to protect everyone. You're just going to listen for your case to be called. When they call you up, you walk up front and then you just tell the judge your story. And again, that's why you want to have the bullet points. So if you get nervous, you can have something to focus on. If you have evidence like a police report, be ready to show that to the judge. If you have your child support worksheets, you can show them that as well. Ideally, you want to get your police report certified, but if you can't, that's okay. Just give them what you have. And then at the end of the hearing, once the judge has heard from both parties, the victim and the abuser, they can go ahead and issue a final 12-month protective order. And you should wait to get a copy of that. And the same thing as with the ex parte, you want to make sure you keep copies of it on your person. Okay. And that is kind of the basics of how you move forward with getting a protective order.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Michelle and Nilu. I have just 3 questions from the audience today. The first one is, how many signs need to show before the relationship is considered abusive? Does it need to be physical abuse?
So how many signs to establish that it's an intimate partner relationship? I think one is sufficient, to be honest. I'll use an example of a case where it was really primarily financial abuse, right? Like it was just a lot of financial control, not giving access to accounts, and sort of terming it as like budgeting. But it was like limiting the victim's access to funds, which limited her ability to leave the situation or have any control in the relationship. And the minute she tried to leave, it became physically violent. And of course, it was a situation where the perpetrator had a gun, so it quickly escalated and became very lethal. So I don't think it has to be different acts, right? Especially with family violence. You just need to establish that there's a pattern of behavior. It could be the same behavior.
Right. And I believe that list of other examples are at the beginning of our presentation today, where you listed out definition of. So, and another question, what advice would you give to a victim once they leave or escape the abusive relationship besides recommending a CPO?
I mean, I always recommend that people get to a domestic violence organization. So they get to safety planning, they get the emotional support that they need. We are lawyers, so we talk to people as lawyers, but sometimes you need a different kind of voice to just help you have a shoulder to cry on. And that can help you sort of cement your commitment to moving on to safety, because otherwise it's easy to get kind of sucked back into the same old pattern of regret and abuse and regret and abuse. So,
Yeah, I know you listed out some great organizations.
mhm.
Those are also available on gregorydelay.org, and will be shared in the description of this video. And the last question is, Michelle, you went over the steps of filing for a TPO. How long does that process usually take?
That's a great
Yeah,
question.
so it's usually pretty quick. And one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of that process is that it's completely free. So there are no filing fees. The sheriff's service fees are waived. So when you go down to fill out your, and it will vary slightly from county to county, but when you go to fill out your paperwork, typically, you get an ex parte order the same day. Because this is considered to be an emergency situation. So they normally will issue your ex parte order, your first order the same day. And then after that, they have to get the abuser served. So that may take a few days to get that done, but they will schedule um, a hearing usually in about 10 days for the follow-up hearing, 10 days or a couple of weeks. So it's usually pretty fast.
And just a reminder that we talk about service in terms of a sheriff. Police officers actually have permission to serve TPOs. They don't often know it, but I know Fulton County TPOs include in that ex parte order like a sheet of paper that directs the police that they can help serve those documents. And one of the key components of a TPO is you file. So let's say I go to the Fulton County Courthouse, I file today, I get my ex parte order. I have to have that second hearing asking that the protective order be extended within 30 days, right? So it has a very tight timeline.
Mhm.
It's why that second hearing is often scheduled about 2 weeks out, so that if there is a service issue, you have some time to try to rectify it and have that second hearing within that 30-day window. Service is a big issue in a lot of civil cases, TPOs and divorces and legitimations. Just know that if a TPO, because at that end of that 30-day window, it's going to get dismissed, you can always refile.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be held against you if you weren't able to serve the other person. Service is often an issue, but you would at least have that ex parte protection in the meantime. But this is where Michelle's advice about working with a DV agency is so important, because they have typically done this work, identified the issues, they have remedies. It's often county specific because they've been working within that county, and they can help you anticipate those issues and then possibly have remedies before it has a negative effect.
Wow, okay, that was the perfect answer, and I think will be helpful for those watching. I just want to say I appreciate that y'all presented not only on the legal rights and resources, but also the context and stigma, which is so important for this discussion. So thank you so much, Nilu and Michelle, for volunteering your expertise and time to provide this information. For those who might have just caught part of it, this will be on our YouTube channel and remain on our Facebook page. Thank you all and have a terrific Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.